Moving on to the second 25 mark question, which is number 8. So let's get right into the question. Evaluate the likely microeconomic consequences. Okay, so macroeconomic consequences of a significant fall in global oil price. And then it gives us a bit of a stimulus of an example when oil prices fell from a 2008 peak of $147 to $27 in 2016. Now, just using a bit of logic, even if you don't know much about economics, you probably know that oil prices, gas prices are not very cheap anymore. And you're probably not likely to get this exact question, but you could see something like Edexcel spin it saying, evaluate the likely macroeconomic effects of a significant increase in global oil prices. And just for some context, global oil prices right now are about $67 per barrel. So it just puts a bit of perspective on how they've changed over the years. Okay, but now back to the question. So we're talking about macroeconomic consequences. And when the question is worded something like macroeconomic consequences, the first thing I'm thinking about is macro objectives. So what I'm going to do now is run through the macro objectives in my head. And the first one, the main one obviously being, is 2% plus or minus 1% inflation. And why is this going to affect the inflation rate? So if we have a significant fall in global oil prices, let's take the UK for example. As we know, the UK is a net importer of raw materials, and of course the UK will import its oil. So if there's a decrease in the price of oil, how is it going to affect our inflation rate? As we know, oil is a commodity and it's used by pretty much every single firm in the UK. So if there's a decrease in oil prices, how is it going to affect UK firms? So lower oil prices mean lower input costs for UK firms. And why is this? Since even if a firm does not explicitly use oil, for example, it's not a petrol station, it doesn't specifically supply oil, every single firm, whether it sells teddy bears or whether it sells cakes, the way they get the ingredients, the way they get the teddy bears is probably transported on a van, on a truck, and that of course uses oil, uses petroleum. So it's going to lower the input costs for all firms in the UK. And which diagram do we use to represent costs? And that would be the that would be the SRAS diagram. So price level on my y-axis and real GDP on my x-axis. I'm going to draw an SRAS curve and an AD curve. So a decrease in costs is going to lead to what? It's going to lead to our SRAS shifting out to now, I'm going to draw this in red, SRAS shifting out to now SRAS1, so shifting out towards the right. And let's see now how this affects our price level. So price level goes from PLE to PL1, and that is, let me try that again, it's a bit messy, to PL1, and that shows the deflation firstly, or the disinflation, whatever you call it, the decrease in inflation rates. And then let's also see the second effect. So price level also increases from YE to, sorry, not price level, real GDP increases from YE to Y1. Why does real GDP increase from YE to Y1? So it's all to do with these input costs. So since these input costs are falling for firms, it means firms can now afford to produce more. And if firms can afford to produce more, it means there's more output. And let's think about back to the definition of what real GDP actually is. Gross domestic product. It means there's more gross domestic product, thus meaning with firms producing, well, since firms can afford to produce more output, it leads to more output, thus meaning an increase in real GDP. And we can stop our chain of analysis there. Or we could think about a different shareholder in the economy, which is consumers. Now, we've talked about there's this deflation occurring or disinflation occurring in the economy. And how is this disinflation going to affect, how does deflation itself affect consumers? How does it affect the value of money? So deflation leads to an increase in the value of the pound. Deflation leads to an increase in the value of the pound, as you can trade that pound for now more goods and services. So for example, if in 2022 you went to the sweet shop, you could buy 100 sweets with £1. And then between 2022 and 2023, if there was 3% deflation, and you went, so now in 2023 you went to the sweet shop, and now you can buy 105 jelly sweets. And that is a concept of deflation. Since deflation has occurred between 2022 and 2023, it means that the pound is now worth more. And if the pound is now worth more, it means you can trade it for more goods and services. So in this example, you can get 5 more jelly sweets when deflation occurs. What effect is that going to lead on incomes? It's going to lead to an increase in real incomes, isn't it? As even though nominal incomes may stay the same, so a worker may still earn 27,000. As each pound is now worth more, yes, he still makes 27,000, but he can buy more goods and services with that £27,000. Thus, why we say an increase in real income. And if there's an increase in real incomes, we say purchasing power increases. And if consumers realise, and if consumers have higher purchasing power, it leads to an increase in consumption. And we say consumption is around 60% of AD, and of course that's going to lead to, that's a major factor of AD, does lead to AD shifting out to the right. And let's sketch that here. So of course we can draw it even with LRAS here, LRAS, and price level on our y-axis, real GDP on our x-axis. So it's going to lead to AD to shift out from AD to AD1, which is going to further amplify that real GDP growth from YE to Y1. So you can answer this question saying the macroeconomic consequence of a significant fall of real GDP is it can lead to several positive effects for the economy, and one of the biggest positive effects, of course, relating it to a macroeconomic objective, is massive levels or just economic growth. Okay, so moving on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph, of course, for your 25 marker, there's a big 9 marks of evaluation. The first one that pops to our mind is we've seen a significant fall in global oil prices. And of course, we said oil is a commodity. So if it's a commodity, one of the characteristics of a commodity, it means it's traded on global markets. So if there's a significant fall in oil prices, let's think about consumer and investor confidence, since a lot of people might have lost a lot of money, and just the general economy. If there's a massive decrease in such a big commodity, it could lead to effect, like we said, investor confidence, consumer confidence effects. Thus meaning our assumption here that increase in real incomes and an increase in purchasing power is going to lead to an increase in consumption could be wrong. It may not be valid, as consumer confidence, investor confidence, animal spirits may be very low after a significant decrease in oil prices, thus meaning that there won't be a shift out of AD, and therefore we won't feel the positive effects of an increase in real GDP. And a great point, I remember a student who actually ended up getting an A star, and you can probably tell why, mentioned to me, is it's related to the macroeconomic objectives again. A smaller macroeconomic objective is environmental sustainability. So you want to move towards becoming more green, for example. And in economics, of course, we assume all firms are profit maximizers. Basically, everything's about incentives. And if the prices of oil fall significantly, so from $147 to $27, it means oil is very cheap. And if oil is very cheap, it massively reduces the incentive for firms to try to find a substitute to oil. So for firms to invest into green energy, basically. And that might lead to, so a significant decrease in the price of oil might lead to a decrease in investment into green energies, thus meaning that massive long-run effects like global warming, rising sea levels. And you could word the evaluation point saying, however, in evaluation, the significant fall in oil prices, positive effects, depends on how it affects environmental sustainability and how it affects the investment into green energies. And like I always say, there's lots of evaluation points here, but in this paragraph specifically, we're going to be talking about the positive effects, like chasing economic growth, increase in GDP. And you can say, however, this depends on the massive negative effects that can occur due to the deflation occurring, since of course here we're seeing that the lower input costs for firms is going to lead to deflation, and you could talk about maybe a deflationary spiral occurring. And of course deflation, you can even relate it to like a real world example about Japan. As we know, deflation is very negative, it leads to several like massive levels of unemployment, etc, etc. So you could actually lead to how you could word the evaluation point. However, in evaluation, this depends, the positive effects of falling oil prices depends on whether it is outweighed by the negative effects of deflation. Of course, since we talk about paper 2, macroeconomics, we talk about the global economy, we could also mention how the oil exporters are impacted, since the oil importers are positively impacted by a fall in oil prices, but the oil exporters, countries like Saudi Arabia, they will probably adversely be negatively affected with things like massive reductions in tax revenue. It would lead to probably budget deficits, things like that. So that could also, those massive economies like Saudi Arabia, where they will go through a downturn in the economic cycle, that could also be passed on to other economies due to the interconnectedness of the global. And that's a brief overview of this 25 mark